In the sterile corridors of St. Catherine's Medical Center, Marcus Thompson moves silently, his footsteps muffled by well-worn sneakers against polished linoleum. The antiseptic smell mingles with the distant hum of ventilators and the occasional beep of monitors echoing from patient rooms. At 28, Marcus has perfected the art of invisibility, wheeling gurneys past residents who barely acknowledge his presence, restocking supplies while doctors discuss cases as if he were furniture, cleaning equipment while nurses gossip about their weekend plans just feet away. No one knows that the man in navy scrubs pushing the meal cart once held a scalpel with the precision of a master surgeon. No one even notices when he pauses at doorways, his dark eyes scanning patient charts, left carelessly on counters, or when his jaw tightens at overheard misdiagnoses. But when the trauma team struggles with a complex case in the emergency department, Marcus stops restocking the supply closet and moves closer to the action. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the trauma bay, where Dr. Rebecca Harrison, the chief resident, stands over a 19-year-old college student named Jake, who was brought in after a motorcycle accident. The young man's face is pale, beads of sweat gathering on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. His breathing comes in short, labored gasps that echo off the sterile walls. "Vitals are stable, but something's not right," Dr. Harrison mutters, her blonde hair escaping from her surgical cap as she leans over the patient. The portable X-ray machine hums in the corner, its screen displaying images that make her frown deeper with each passing second. The chest X-ray shows minor rib fractures, nothing that should cause this level of respiratory distress. Dr. Kevin Mitchell, the attending physician, approaches with measured steps, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the floor. At 45, he carries himself with the confidence of someone who's never been questioned, his silver temples and designer glasses lending him an air of distinguished authority. He glances at the monitor, then at the patient, his expression skeptical. "Patient's probably just anxious," he says dismissively, barely looking up from his tablet. "College kids, you know how they are. Give him some oxygen and run another blood panel. The X-ray's clear enough." But Marcus, who has been quietly replacing gauze packages in the nearby supply cabinet, freezes at those words, his hands still on the metal shelf as he listens to Jake's breathing pattern, the subtle wheeze on inspiration, the way the young man's shoulders rise with each breath, the pale blue tinge around his fingernails that the doctors seem to have missed in their rush to dismiss his symptoms. Marcus steps closer, his movements careful and deliberate. The trauma bay smells of betadine and fear, the sharp scent of medical tape mixing with the metallic tang of blood from Jake's minor cuts. He can hear the boy's girlfriend crying softly in the waiting room beyond the glass doors, can see the way Jake's eyes dart frantically between the medical staff, searching for someone who understands his distress. "Doctor," Marcus says quietly, his deep voice cutting through the ambient noise of monitors and conversation. Dr. Harrison barely glances in his direction, but he continues anyway. "You might want to check for pneumothorax." The breath sounds on the left side. Dr. Mitchell's head snaps up, his grey eyes narrowing with irritation. "Excuse me?" His voice carries the sharp edge of authority challenged. "Did the orderly just attempt to give medical advice?" The trauma bay falls silent, except for Jake's labored breathing. 3 nurses pause in their tasks. A respiratory therapist stops adjusting equipment, and even the medical students, standing against the far wall, turn to watch the unfolding scene. The air grows thick with tension as institutional hierarchy hangs in the balance. Marcus feels the familiar weight of dismissal, the same look he's seen countless times over the past 18 months. The raised eyebrows, the barely concealed smirks, the way medical staff exchange glances that say, "Can you believe this?" He's learned to recognize the microaggressions, the subtle ways his observations are brushed aside before they're even considered. What they didn't know was that Marcus Thompson once diagnosed a rare cardiac condition that saved a senator's life, had published research in the Journal of Emergency Medicine, and had been considered for a fellowship at Johns Hopkins before his world came crashing down. His medical degree from Harvard hangs in a storage unit across town, gathering dust alongside his board certifications and letters of recommendation from department heads who once called him brilliant. Dr. Harrison adjusts her stethoscope, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, but unwilling to challenge her superior. "Maybe we should just double-check the films," she suggests tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper. "The films are fine," Dr. Mitchell states firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "And I don't need housekeeping staff second-guessing my medical decisions." He turns back to the patient, effectively dismissing Marcus with his body language. But Jake's condition is worsening. His breathing becomes more shallow, his skin taking on a greyish pallor that makes the nurses exchange worried glances. The pulse oximeter shows his oxygen saturation dropping despite the supplemental oxygen flowing through his nasal cannula. Marcus watches from the supply cabinet, his hands clenched at his sides. Every instinct screams at him to intervene, to push past protocol and hierarchy and save a life. He can see what they're missing, the subtle signs of a tension pneumothorax building pressure in Jake's chest cavity, slowly collapsing his lung and compressing his heart. And with just one more breath, Jake's condition was about to become critical. Because sometimes the most important voices in a hospital aren't the ones with the loudest titles, but the ones with the clearest sight. Sometimes wisdom comes from unexpected places, and sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one truly seeing. The heart monitor's steady beep begins to falter, and Marcus realizes he's about to witness either a tragedy or a revelation. Either way, nothing in St. Catherine's Medical Center would ever be the same. Before we dive deeper into Marcus's incredible story, I need you to help this message reach more people who need to hear it. Stories like this happen every single day in hospitals across America, where qualified professionals are overlooked simply because of how they look or what their job title says. If this opening grabbed your attention and made you think about the hidden talents around us, please hit that subscribe button. We share real stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and your subscription helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how shocked are you that Marcus was dismissed so quickly? Drop your rating in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about your reaction. And if you've ever felt invisible in your workplace or had your expertise questioned, share your story below. This community is built on lifting each other up and recognizing that expertise doesn't always come with the expected package. The notification bell is your friend. Hit it so you never miss stories that might change how you see the world around you. Now, let's find out exactly who Marcus Thompson really is and why his quiet observation was about to save a life. Marcus Thompson had worked at St. Catherine's Medical Center for 18 months, arriving each morning at 6 a.m. to begin his 12-hour shift in the orderly department. His routine never varied: clock in at the staff entrance, change into his navy blue scrubs in the basement locker room, and begin the first of many rounds through the hospital's sprawling corridors. The executive floors gleamed with marble and mahogany, donor plaques catching the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, while he worked primarily in the functional areas where the real medicine happened. The doctors and nurses walked past him as if he were part of the hospital's infrastructure, as invisible as the IV poles he wheeled or the linens he delivered. They discussed complex cases over his head while he cleaned equipment, debated treatment protocols while he restocked supplies, and made life-or-death decisions while he quietly went about his tasks. To them, he was just another hospital employee, in scrubs, someone who kept the wheels turning but wasn't worth remembering by name. But Marcus watched. He always watched. The irony wasn't lost on him that he knew more about the daily medical operations of St. Catherine's than most of the residents rotating through their various departments. He'd observed thousands of cases. From his unique vantage point, seen patterns that the rushed medical staff missed, noticed details that fell through the cracks of busy shifts and overwhelming patient loads. On that particular Tuesday morning in March, the trauma department buzzed with an energy that Marcus recognized, the controlled chaos of a teaching hospital where learning and life-saving intersected. He'd been restocking the code cart when he overheard Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Harrison discussing the motorcycle accident victim in Trauma Bay 3. Marcus heard something that made his hands pause over the defibrillator pads, his pulse quickening with recognition. Patients presenting with chest pain and shortness of breath following blunt trauma, Dr. Harrison was saying, her voice carrying the careful cadence of a resident presenting to her attending. Initial chest X-ray shows minor rib fractures on the left side, no obvious pneumothorax visible. Vitals? Dr. Mitchell's voice held that familiar tone of controlled impatience that Marcus had heard hundreds of times, the sound of an experienced physician moving through cases with efficiency. Blood pressure holding steady at 110/70, heart rate elevated at 95, oxygen saturation at 92% on room air. Marcus moved closer, pretending to organize supplies while his trained ear picked up the subtle details in their conversation. Those words weren't foreign to him. They were the language he'd spoken fluently for 7 years before his life took an unexpected turn. He whispered under his breath, "Check for occult pneumothorax. Expiratory film might show what you're missing, Doctor." Mitchell caught the quiet words and turned with a sharp look. "Did you say something?" Marcus felt the familiar flush of embarrassment rise in his cheeks. "Sorry, Doctor, just..." The patient's symptoms sound like they could be more than anxiety. The attending physician's eyebrows rose in disbelief, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to outright condescension. "The orderly has medical opinions now." He turned to Dr. Harrison with a smirk. "Perhaps we should ask housekeeping for their diagnostic input as well." But deep inside, something had stirred in Marcus, a combination of professional instinct and personal frustration that he'd been suppressing for months. He recognized the signs that the medical team was missing, could hear in Jake's breathing pattern the subtle indicators that his condition was more serious than they realized. Marcus had been in their position once, standing in trauma bays, making critical decisions while the clock ticked and lives hung in the balance. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the adrenaline that came with emergency medicine, the satisfaction of solving complex diagnostic puzzles that could mean the difference between life and death. Dr. Harrison looked uncomfortable with the exchange, clearly caught between her attending's authority and her own clinical instincts. She was young enough to remember that medicine could surprise even experienced physicians, but hierarchical enough to know that questioning Dr. Mitchell in front of staff could damage her standing in the program. "The X-ray does look clear," she said diplomatically, though Marcus caught the uncertainty in her voice. As the medical team moved on to discuss treatment options, Marcus returned to his supply cart, but his mind was racing. He'd seen this exact presentation before, the subtle signs of a pneumothorax that didn't show up clearly on initial chest films. The patient's breathing pattern, the slight asymmetry in chest movement, the way his oxygen saturation hovered just below normal despite supplemental oxygen. In his previous life, Marcus would have ordered an expiratory chest film or considered a chest CT to rule out what the initial X-ray might have missed. He would have listened more carefully to the patient's lung sounds, would have asked questions about the mechanism of injury and the timeline of symptoms. But in his current life, he was expected to restock supplies and transport patients, to be helpful but invisible, competent but silent. The irony burned in his chest. He possessed knowledge that could help Jake, but lacked the authority or credibility to share it effectively. Marcus finished organizing the supply cart and moved on to his next task, but Jake's case lingered in his mind. As he wheeled a patient to radiology, delivered lab specimens to pathology, and cleaned equipment in the surgical suite, he found himself thinking about the young man in Trauma Bay 3. The hospital's afternoon shift change brought new energy to the floors, fresh faces replacing tired ones, but Marcus's shift continued. He'd learned to pace himself through the long days, to find satisfaction in the small ways he could contribute to patient care, ensuring equipment was ready when needed, making sure supplies were stocked for emergency situations, being an extra pair of hands when the medical staff was overwhelmed. But today felt different. Today he'd spoken up, had tried to share his clinical observation, and had been dismissed not because his input was wrong, but because of who he was and what his job title said about his qualifications. As evening approached and the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, Marcus found himself passing by the trauma department more frequently than his duties required. Each time he caught glimpses of Jake through the partially open door of Trauma Bay 3, saw the way the young man's condition seemed to be subtly declining despite the medical team's confidence in their diagnosis. The weight of knowledge sat heavily on Marcus's shoulders, the burden of seeing what others missed, of knowing that his expertise could make a difference if anyone would listen. He'd built his career on trusting his clinical instincts, on being willing to consider uncommon presentations and think beyond the obvious diagnoses. That wasn't just embarrassment he'd felt when Dr. Mitchell dismissed him so casually. That was righteous indignation finally waking up after months of being treated as invisible, after watching his knowledge go unused while he performed tasks that utilized only a fraction of his abilities. As his shift neared its end, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't ignore what he was seeing, couldn't let hierarchy and prejudice override his medical training. Jake's life might depend on someone being willing to speak truth to power, even if that someone was just an orderly in navy blue scrubs. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths about both institutional bias and hidden expertise, where assumptions would be challenged and lives would hang in the balance of who was willing to listen. 3 hours later, the trauma department still buzzed with the controlled energy of a busy evening shift, but Marcus noticed the subtle signs that Jake's condition was deteriorating. As he delivered clean linens to the nurse's station, he caught sight of the young man through the open doorway of Trauma Bay 3. His breathing had become more labored, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that made Marcus's trained eye recognize the progression of respiratory compromise. The monitors continued their steady electronic chorus, but Marcus could see what the numbers weren't fully capturing. Jake's oxygen saturation had dropped to 89%, despite increased supplemental oxygen, and his heart rate had climbed to 105 beats per minute. Most concerning was the way Jake's chest rose and fell asymmetrically, his left side moving less freely than his right. Dr. Mitchell still held court near the nurse's station, his confidence unshaken as he discussed the case with a group of medical students who hung on his every word like gospel. His silver hair caught the fluorescent light as he gestured toward Jake's room, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Classic anxiety reaction to trauma, he was explaining, his tone professorial and certain. Young patients often hyperventilate following accidents, especially when they're in an unfamiliar environment like a hospital. The minor rib fractures explain the chest pain, and once the anxiety subsides, the respiratory distress will resolve. Dr. Harrison stood at the periphery of the group, her expression troubled as she glanced repeatedly toward Jake's room. Marcus could see the conflict in her posture. The way she shifted her weight from foot to foot, the way her fingers drummed against her tablet, the way she kept looking at the patient as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she was being told. Marcus approached the supply closet adjacent to the nurse's station, his movements deliberately casual as he began organizing medication supplies. From this vantage point, he could observe both the medical team's discussion and Jake's deteriorating condition, the proximity allowing him to hear the subtle changes in the young man's breathing pattern. That's when Jake's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. A sharp gasp echoed from Trauma Bay 3, followed by the sound of someone struggling for air. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor suddenly accelerated, becoming a rapid staccato that cut through the ambient hospital noise. Jake's oxygen saturation plummeted to 82%, then 79%, triggering the alarm that sent nurses rushing toward his room. Marcus abandoned the supply closet and moved closer, his clinical instincts overriding workplace protocol. Through the doorway, he could see Jake's eyes wide with panic, his lips taking on a bluish tinge as he struggled to draw breath. The young man's left chest appeared visibly smaller than his right, the telltale sign of lung collapse that Marcus had been fearing. "Something's wrong," Dr. Harrison called out, her voice tight with concern as she rushed to Jake's bedside. His satsa dropping fast, and look at his chest movement. Dr. Mitchell approached with measured steps, his confidence beginning to show the first hairline cracks as he took in Jake's obviously deteriorating condition. The heart monitor now showed a rate of 125 beats per minute, and Jake's blood pressure had begun to climb. Classic signs of cardiovascular stress that could no longer be dismissed as anxiety. Without thinking, Marcus spoke from the doorway, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. "It's a tension pneumothorax. You need to decompress now or you're going to lose him." Dead silence fell over Trauma Bay 3. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward Marcus. Dr. Mitchell's filled with outrage, Dr. Harrison's wide with surprise, the nurses looking between the orderly and their attending physician with obvious confusion. Even Jake seemed to focus on Marcus through his distress, as if sensing that someone finally understood what was happening to him. Dr. Mitchell's face flushed red with indignation, his professional composure cracking under the pressure of being contradicted by someone he considered far beneath his expertise. "How dare you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "How dare you walk into my trauma bay and pretend to diagnose my patient?" But Marcus had crossed a line from which there was no return. 18 months of being invisible, of watching and knowing, but being unable to act, suddenly crystallized into this moment where a young man's life hung in the balance. His voice remained steady, professional, carrying the authority of someone who had stood in this exact position many times before. "Look at his tracheal deviation," Marcus said, pointing toward Jake's neck where the windpipe had shifted slightly to the right. "Look at the way his left chest isn't expanding. His neck veins are becoming distended despite normal blood pressure. These are classic signs of tension pneumothorax that won't show up on a standard chest X-ray taken during inspiration." Dr. Harrison stepped closer to examine Jake's neck, her trained eyes now seeing what Marcus had pointed out. The subtle shift in the trachea's position, barely visible but definitely present, was a late sign of pressure building in the left chest cavity. "He's right," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the monitor alarms. "The trachea is deviating." "Don't you dare encourage this!" Dr. Mitchell snapped, but his own eyes were now scanning Jake's chest and neck, his clinical training warring with his wounded pride. The X-ray showed minor rib fractures, nothing more. Marcus stepped fully into the room now, his presence commanding attention despite his humble uniform. An inspiratory chest film can miss a small pneumothorax that becomes apparent on expiration. With the mechanism of injury, blunt chest trauma from a motorcycle accident, and the progressive respiratory distress, you need to consider that air is accumulating in the pleural space and compressing the lung. The tension in the room was palpable, career hierarchies and institutional protocols colliding with urgent medical necessity. Jake's condition continued to worsen, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as precious seconds ticked away. Dr. Harrison looked between her attending and the patient, her medical training finally overriding her fear of authority. "Dr. Mitchell, his condition is deteriorating rapidly. Maybe we should get another chest film or consider—" "Fine," Dr. Mitchell interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Get a portable chest X-ray, expiratory view, but when this comes back negative, I want security to escort our diagnostic orderly out of this department." As the portable X-ray machine was wheeled into position, Marcus stepped back but remained in the doorway, his heart pounding with the familiar rhythm of emergency medicine. He'd made his stand, had spoken the truth as he saw it, and now Jake's life would prove whether his clinical instincts were still as sharp as they'd been before his world fell apart. The radiology technician positioned Jake for the expiratory film, the young man's distress making cooperation difficult. Each movement seemed to worsen his breathing, and Marcus could see the way Jake's skin was becoming more ashen despite the supplemental oxygen flowing through his face mask. Dr. Mitchell stood with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched as he waited for the X-ray results that he was certain would vindicate his diagnosis and expose Marcus as an overreaching employee who had forgotten his place. The medical students watched nervously, sensing they were witnessing something that would be discussed in medical school hallways for years to come. But Marcus wasn't thinking about vindication or embarrassment. He was watching Jake struggle for. Each breath was calculating how much time they had before the pressure in the young man's chest cavity compressed his heart enough to cause cardiovascular collapse. In his mind, he was already planning the life-saving procedure that would need to be performed if his diagnosis proved correct. The X-ray machine hummed to life, capturing the image that would either confirm Marcus's clinical assessment or end his involvement in Jake's care forever. In that moment, suspended between diagnosis and dismissal, Marcus realized that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. Jake's life was about to prove who had been truly seeing and who had been merely looking. In his modest one-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from the hospital, Marcus sat with a leather-bound medical journal in his lap, its cover worn smooth from countless readings. The pages contained his published research on emergency thoracic procedures, complete with detailed diagrams and case studies that had earned him recognition in the emergency medicine community. On the nightstand beside him sat a framed photograph of him in surgical scrubs, standing with the trauma team at Boston General Hospital, his bright smile radiating the confidence of someone at the pinnacle of his profession. The apartment was sparse but clean. A small kitchen table where he ate solitary meals, a second-hand couch facing a modest television, medical textbooks stacked on makeshift shelves constructed from boards and cinder blocks. The contrast between his current life and the prestigious hospital corridors where he'd once walked as Dr. Marcus Thompson was stark enough to take his breath away on difficult nights. Back then, emergency medicine was his language, spoken with the fluency of someone who had trained at Harvard Medical School and completed his residency at one of the nation's most demanding trauma centers. He'd been the resident that attendings called when cases got complicated, the doctor that nurses trusted when seconds mattered, the physician that families thanked when their loved ones survived impossible odds. His specialty had been thoracic trauma, the exact type of case that Jake represented. Marcus had successfully diagnosed and treated dozens of pneumothoraces, had published papers on the subtle presentations that could be missed on initial imaging, had taught medical students the clinical signs that could save lives when technology failed to provide clear answers. The research journal in his lap fell open to a page he'd read countless times, an article titled Occult Pneumothorax in Blunt Chest Trauma, Clinical Indicators Beyond Radiographic Evidence. The lead author was listed as Marcus Thompson, MD, with credentials that seemed to belong to a different person now: Harvard Medical School, board-certified in emergency medicine, fellowship in trauma surgery. That article had been cited in medical literature 47 times, had influenced emergency department protocols in hospitals across the country, and had established Marcus as a rising authority in his field. The irony that Dr. Mitchell had likely read this research without ever connecting it to the orderly he'd dismissed so casually wasn't lost on Marcus. The last time he'd held that journal with pride instead of pain had been 3 years ago, when his world still made sense. Back then, he'd been engaged to Dr. Sarah Chen, a brilliant pediatric surgeon who'd supported his research and shared his passion for saving lives. They'd planned to marry after her fellowship, to build a life together dedicated to medicine and service. The phone call had come on a Tuesday morning in October, while Marcus was reviewing trauma protocols for a presentation he was scheduled to give at a national emergency medicine conference. Sarah's voice had been strained, barely recognizable through her tears. "It's Mum," she'd whispered across the long-distance connection to California. "She's had a stroke. The doctors say she might not recover. I have to come home." "Marcus, I have to be here with Dad." The next 6 months became a blur of difficult decisions and impossible choices. Sarah's mother required full-time care, her father couldn't manage alone, and the family's small restaurant business, their livelihood for 30 years, was failing without Sarah's mother's management expertise. What was supposed to be a temporary leave from her fellowship became a permanent move home to help her family survive their crisis. Marcus had followed without hesitation, choosing love over career advancement, family over professional prestige. He'd resigned from his position at Boston General, had withdrawn from the conference speaking circuit, and had moved across the country to support the woman he loved and the family that had welcomed him as their own. But California's medical licensing requirements created unexpected barriers. His Massachusetts credentials needed extensive documentation to transfer. The process took months longer than anticipated, and by the time he was eligible to practice, the economy had shifted and hospital positions had become scarce. Trauma surgery positions were particularly competitive, especially for physicians who'd been out of active practice for nearly a year. Sarah's mother had lingered for 14 months, requiring constant care and draining the family's resources, despite Marcus working construction jobs and Sarah managing the restaurant. When Mrs. Chen finally passed, the grief was compounded by financial reality. The medical bills had consumed their savings, the restaurant was deeply in debt, and Marcus's career momentum had completely stalled. Sarah had been offered a position at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, but the salary wasn't enough to support both of them while Marcus searched for a medical position. Pride had prevented him from asking his former colleagues for help, and the longer he remained out of practice, the more difficult it became to re-enter at his previous level. The orderly position at St. Catherine's had been meant as a temporary solution, a way to earn income while staying connected to medicine and rebuilding his professional network. But temporary had stretched into 18 months, and each day of pushing gurneys and restocking supplies had felt like another step away from the physician he'd been. The final blow had come 8 months ago when Sarah's career demands and their financial stress had strained their relationship beyond repair. The woman who'd once called him brilliant now looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration, unable to reconcile the accomplished doctor she'd fallen in love with and the hospital orderly who came home exhausted from menial labor. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said on a rain-soaked evening in November, her engagement ring sitting on the kitchen table between them like an accusation. "I need someone who can be my equal again, who can support our future instead of dwelling in the past." Marcus had watched her leave with quiet dignity, had helped her pack her belongings without argument or recrimination. He understood her choice, even as it broke his heart, recognized that his sacrifice had cost them both more than either had anticipated. But alone in his apartment, holding the medical journal that represented everything he'd once been, Marcus realized something important. He hadn't left medicine behind. Medicine had never left him. Every day at St. Catherine's he observed and learned, staying current with procedures and protocols, even if he couldn't actively practice them. The knowledge that had made him an exceptional emergency physician was still there, still sharp, still relevant. His ability to recognize clinical patterns, to see beyond obvious presentations, to trust his instincts when others missed critical details, none of that had diminished despite his changed circumstances. As he prepared for another shift at the hospital, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He would no longer apologize for his expertise or remain silent when patient care was at stake. Jake's case had awakened something in him that 18 months of invisibility had tried to suppress. The physician's imperative to heal, regardless of personal cost. He carefully placed the medical journal back on his nightstand, next to the photograph of the doctor he'd been. Tomorrow he would return to St. Catherine's not as an apologetic orderly hoping to avoid notice, but as someone whose knowledge could save lives, even if that knowledge came wrapped in navy blue scrubs instead of a white coat. "There it is," he whispered to himself in the quiet apartment. It was always there. The expertise that had once made him exceptional hadn't disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to resurface. Jake's crisis had provided that moment, and Marcus was finally ready to stop hiding who he truly was, regardless of the consequences. The hospital was still asleep when Marcus stepped through the employee entrance at 5:30 a.m., his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor as maintenance crews finished their overnight cleaning. The familiar antiseptic smell greeted him, mixed with the faint aroma of coffee brewing in the physician's lounge and the distant sound of early shift nurses receiving report on their patients. Instead of heading directly to the locker room, as usual, Marcus made his way to the radiology department through corridors he'd walked hundreds of times, but never with such purpose. The portable X-ray from Jake's case had been processed hours ago, the images uploaded to the hospital's digital system, where they waited for review by the radiologist assigned to overnight emergency cases. Marcus had been thinking about those images all night, visualizing what they would show based on Jake's clinical presentation. His years of emergency medicine experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that others missed, to see beyond the obvious and consider the possibilities that standard protocols might overlook. He entered the radiology reading room through the employee access corridor, a space he'd cleaned countless times but never truly occupied. The room hummed with the quiet energy of high-tech equipment, multiple monitors glowing in the dim lighting, as computer systems processed the constant stream of imaging studies from throughout the hospital. The workstation where overnight emergency studies were reviewed sat empty, the radiologist having completed their initial reading and moved on to other cases. But the images remained on the screen, and Marcus knew exactly where to find them in the hospital's computerized system. His fingers moved with practiced precision across the keyboard, accessing the patient database with credentials he'd observed being used countless times. Jake Morrison, age 19, Trauma Bay 3. The case file opened with a soft electronic chime that seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. The initial chest X-ray appeared on the high-resolution monitor, its black and white patterns as familiar to Marcus as a language he'd spoken fluently for years. Just as he'd suspected, the inspiratory view showed only minor rib fractures on the left side, the kind of findings that would typically be considered insignificant in a stable patient. But Marcus scrolled to the expiratory film that Dr. Mitchell had reluctantly ordered, and there it was, clear as daylight for anyone who knew what to look for. The pneumothorax that had been invisible on the first image was now obvious on the expiratory view, a dark space where air had accumulated between the lung and chest wall, compressing the vital organ and explaining all of Jake's symptoms. No hesitation. Marcus pulled up the radiology reporting system and began documenting what he saw with the precision and medical terminology that had once been second nature to him. His training took over, years of emergency medicine experience guiding his fingers, as he typed a detailed interpretation that would alert the medical team to Jake's true diagnosis. Expiratory chest radiograph demonstrates moderate pneumothorax on the left side, measuring approximately 30% lung collapse. This finding was not evident on the initial inspiratory view. Given the patient's mechanism of injury and clinical presentation, urgent thoracostomy is indicated to prevent progression to tension pneumothorax. When he finished the report, Marcus looked at the screen one final time, knowing that his intervention would soon trigger a chain of events that would save Jake's life, but likely end his own employment at St. Catherine's. The report was signed, with his employee credentials, making it impossible to claim the observation had come from anyone else. There was nothing else to say. He quietly logged out of the system and left the radiology department, making his way through the still, quiet corridors toward the trauma unit, where Jake continued to struggle for each breath. Dawn was beginning to filter through the hospital's eastern windows when Dr. Harrison arrived for her early morning rounds, coffee in hand, as she checked on the patients from her overnight shift. The trauma department carried the peaceful energy of a night shift winding down, most emergency cases stabilized or transferred to appropriate units for ongoing care. But Jake's room still hummed with the activity of continuous monitoring, his condition having stabilized somewhat overnight, but remaining concerning enough to warrant close observation. Dr. Harrison paused at his doorway, noting that his breathing still appeared labored despite supplemental oxygen and pain medication. Her tablet chimed with an incoming message, a radiology report flagged as urgent for her attention. She opened the file with casual interest, expecting routine confirmation of the minor rib fractures that Dr. Mitchell had diagnosed the evening before. Instead, she found herself staring at a detailed report that contradicted everything they'd assumed about Jake's condition. The expiratory chest X-ray showed clear evidence of pneumothorax, complete with precise measurements and recommendations for immediate intervention. "This can't be right," whispered Dr. Harrison, her voice barely audible in the quiet corridor. She rushed to the radiology department, her coffee forgotten as she pulled up Jake's imaging studies on the large monitors used for detailed review. The difference between the two films was striking once she knew what to look for: the inspiratory view that had seemed clear hours ago, and the expiratory view that showed unmistakable evidence of lung collapse. Within minutes, the trauma department transformed from quiet morning routine to controlled urgency. Dr. Harrison called Dr. Mitchell at home, her voice tight with concern as she explained the radiologist's findings. Other residents gathered around Jake's room as equipment was prepared for the thoracostomy procedure that would relieve the pressure in his chest cavity. "How did we miss this?" Dr. Mitchell demanded as he arrived at the hospital, his usual composure, shaken by the realization that a patient had spent hours with an undiagnosed pneumothorax. The initial X-ray was negative. The patient was stable. Dr. Harrison hesitated before answering, remembering Marcus's words from the night before. "Actually, the orderly, Marcus Thompson, he tried to tell us. He said we should check for pneumothorax," mentioned the expiratory film specifically. The trauma bay fell silent except for the sound of Jake's labored breathing and the steady beep of monitors. Dr. Mitchell's face went pale as the implications hit him. Not only had they nearly missed a life-threatening diagnosis, but the correct assessment had come from someone he'd dismissed without consideration. "Find him," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Find Marcus Thompson and bring him here, now." The social media post about the overnight drama had already begun spreading through the hospital's informal communication network. Nurses whispered about the orderly who diagnosed what the doctors missed. Residents shared the story during morning report, and by 8 a.m., the tale had reached the hospital's administrative offices, where questions were being asked about how such a situation could occur. They found Marcus in the supply room on the 3rd floor, methodically restocking surgical instruments as if the previous 12 hours had been routine. His movements were precise and economical, each action performed with the quiet efficiency he'd developed over 18 months of hospital work. The morning light streaming through nearby windows caught the concentration on his face as he organized. Equipment with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to life-saving procedures. "Marcus Thompson." Dr. Harrison's voice carried a mixture of respect and uncertainty that hadn't been there the night before. She stood in the doorway with Dr. Mitchell beside her, both physicians looking somehow smaller than they had when dismissing him hours earlier. Marcus turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting theirs with calm dignity. He'd been expecting this moment since he'd typed that radiology report, had prepared himself for either vindication or termination. Either way, Jake's life had been saved, and that knowledge gave him a peace he hadn't felt in months. "Dr. Harrison, Dr. Mitchell," he acknowledged with a slight nod, his voice steady and professional. "How is Jake doing?" Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, his usual commanding presence tempered by something Marcus had never seen before, humility mixed with genuine curiosity. "The thoracostomy was successful. Jake's breathing improved immediately after we relieved the pneumothorax. He's stable now, expected to make a full recovery." "I'm glad to hear that," Marcus replied simply, returning to his inventory of surgical supplies. The lack of dramatic emotion in his response seemed to surprise both physicians, who had perhaps expected either gloating or defensive explanations. "We need to talk," Dr. Mitchell continued, his tone carrying none of the dismissive authority from their previous encounter. "There are questions that need answers." Marcus set down the instrument tray he'd been organizing and followed them to Dr. Mitchell's office, a space he'd cleaned many times but never entered as anything other than maintenance staff. The office reflected its occupant status. Medical journals lined the walls, diplomas and awards hung in precise arrangements, and a massive desk dominated the room with its air of institutional authority. Dr. Harrison closed the door behind them, creating an intimate space where hierarchy seemed less important than truth. Marcus sat across from the physicians, his employee badge clearly visible on his navy scrubs. The contrast between his humble appearance and the conversation they were about to have hanging heavy in the air. "You want to know who I am?" Marcus said before either physician could speak. So I'll tell you. He reached into his wallet and withdrew a folded piece of paper, a photocopy of his medical license from Massachusetts, the one he'd never been able to fully transfer to California due to bureaucratic delays and changed circumstances. The document bore his name, Marcus Thompson, MD, along with credentials that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Dr. Mitchell took the paper with careful hands, his eyes scanning the official text as his expression shifted from skepticism to amazement. Harvard Medical School, board certified in emergency medicine, fellowship in trauma surgery at Boston General Hospital. He looked up at Marcus with new eyes. This is you?" "It was me," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of choices made and opportunities lost. 3 years ago, I was Dr. Marcus Thompson, attending physician in one of Boston's busiest trauma centers. I published research on thoracic emergencies, taught residents, spoke at conferences. The diagnosis I made last night, I've made it dozens of times before. Dr. Harrison leaned forward, her young face filled with questions. "What happened? How did you end up working as an orderly?" Marcus finished her unspoken question with a slight smile. "Life happened. My fiancé's family needed help, so I moved to California to support them through a crisis. By the time I was ready to return to medicine, the licensing process had stalled, positions were scarce, and I needed income while I figured out my next steps." He paused, looking out the window at the hospital parking lot where he'd walked countless times as an invisible employee. 18 months ago, I took this job as a temporary solution. I thought I'd be back in scrubs as a physician within 6 months, but temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you're not paying attention. Dr. Mitchell set the medical license on his desk with reverence, as if handling a sacred document. "The research you published on occult pneumothorax, I've read it. I've cited it in my own work. Your methodology for clinical diagnosis without clear radiographic evidence? That's exactly what you did last night." "I didn't leave medicine," Marcus said quietly. "Medicine never left me. Every day I work in this hospital, I observe and learn. I see cases, recognize patterns, understand diagnoses. The only difference is that nobody listens when I speak because they see the uniform instead of the knowledge." The room fell silent as the full weight of institutional prejudice settled over them. Here was a physician, not former physician, but someone whose knowledge and instincts remained sharp and relevant, who had been dismissed not because his assessment was wrong, but because his appearance didn't match their expectations of medical authority. Dr. Harrison broke the silence, her voice soft with regret. "Last night, when you tried to tell us about the pneumothorax, we should have listened. We should have considered your input regardless of your job title." "You should have," Marcus agreed without bitterness. "But I understand why you didn't. Hospitals run on hierarchy and credentials. When someone in work clothes speaks medical terminology, it challenges assumptions about who has the right to medical opinions." Dr. Mitchell stood and walked to his window, looking out at the hospital, grounds where Marcus had spent 18 months being invisible. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, he said slowly. "I've prided myself on being thorough, on listening to my patients and my colleagues. But I realize now that I've been deaf to voices that didn't come from the right sources." He turned back to Marcus with an expression of genuine remorse. "You saved that young man's life. Not just with your diagnosis, but with your persistence in speaking up despite being dismissed. That took courage I'm not sure I would have had in your position." Marcus nodded acknowledgement of the apology, but his focus remained practical. "The question now is what happens next. I intervened in patient care outside my authorized role, accessed medical records without proper credentials, and essentially practiced medicine without a license. I assume my employment here is terminated." "Actually," Dr. Mitchell said with the first smile Marcus had seen from him, "I think we need to discuss how to fix this situation properly. This hospital has policies for credentialing experienced physicians who want to return to practice, and we have an opening in our emergency department for someone with your exact expertise." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline Marcus had stopped believing could exist. After 18 months of being invisible, of suppressing his medical knowledge, of accepting that his career might be permanently derailed, the possibility of returning to the work he loved seemed almost too good to be real. "There would be conditions," Dr. Harrison added quickly. "Credentialing review, supervised practice while your California license finalizes, probably starting as an attending rather than department head. But your knowledge is too valuable to waste in supply rooms." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, not the pain of dreams deferred, but the tentative hope of dreams reborn. "I would accept those conditions," he said simply. "I never wanted to stop being a doctor. I just needed someone to see past the uniform." In that quiet office, institutional barriers began to crumble as 3 physicians recognized that expertise didn't always come packaged as expected, and that sometimes the most important medical voices belonged to those who had been overlooked. The conversation that followed would reshape not just Marcus's future, but how St. Catherine's Medical Center approached the hidden talents within its own walls. The next morning, Marcus stepped into St. Catherine's Medical Center. Through the main entrance instead of the employee door, his reflection in the glass doors showing a man transformed. He wore dark slacks and a button-down shirt beneath a pristine white coat, the MD embroidered on the breast pocket, catching the morning light. After 18 months of Navy scrubs and invisible status, the simple act of walking through the front lobby felt like reclaiming a piece of his identity. But something was different about the usual morning bustle. Conversations paused as he passed, staff members looking up from their workstations with expressions of recognition and curiosity. Word had spread through the hospital's communication network faster than he'd anticipated. The story of the orderly who'd saved a life with a diagnosis that stumped the attending physicians had become legendary overnight. The trauma department buzzed with an energy Marcus hadn't experienced since his Boston days. As he approached the nurses' station, wearing his white coat like armor reclaimed, the room gradually fell silent. Then, unexpectedly, a wave of applause began. First from Janet, the trauma nurse who'd worked alongside him for months, then spreading to the residents, medical students, and staff who'd witnessed the previous night's events. "Dr. Thompson," Janet said with a smile that held both respect and apology, "welcome back to medicine." The applause continued as Marcus stood surrounded by colleagues who had overlooked him for 18 months, but now saw him clearly. The sound echoed off the trauma bay walls, a recognition not just of his medical skills, but of the quiet dignity with which he'd endured being invisible while possessing knowledge that could save lives. Dr. Mitchell emerged from his office, approaching Marcus with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal regret. "The credentialing committee met in emergency session last night," he announced to the gathered staff. "Dr. Marcus Thompson has been granted provisional attending privileges in emergency medicine, pending completion of his California licensing. Requirements." Later that afternoon, the hospital's administration made an unprecedented decision. Dr. Margaret Hayes, the chief medical officer, announced the creation of a new initiative called the Hidden Expertise Recognition Program, designed to identify and utilize the medical knowledge that existed throughout the hospital in unexpected places. "Yesterday's events have taught us that expertise doesn't always come with the expected credentials," Dr. Hayes explained to the assembled medical staff. "We have nurses with advanced degrees working as techs, former physicians in support roles, and international doctors whose credentials haven't been recognized. We're going to change that. Marcus was invited to lead the program, his experience bridging the gap between invisible hospital worker and practicing physician, making him uniquely qualified to identify others whose talents had been overlooked. Under one condition that he'd insisted upon, the program would evaluate people based on knowledge and competence, not on their current job titles or the prestige of their backgrounds. The auditorium was packed for Marcus's first presentation. The medical staff, his topic chosen with deliberate intent, recognizing clinical excellence in unexpected places, lessons from the margins. He stepped up to the podium and looked out at faces that ranged from curious to skeptical, seeing some who had dismissed him and others who had recognized his worth. 18 months ago, I walked into this hospital as someone whose medical career had been derailed by circumstances beyond my control, he began, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. I took a job as an orderly not because I'd lost my medical knowledge, but because I needed to survive while rebuilding my professional life. The audience listened with rapt attention as Marcus described his journey from respected physician to invisible hospital worker, his observations about institutional hierarchy, and the night when patient care had finally trumped workplace politics. Every day in this hospital, you work alongside people whose backgrounds would surprise you, he continued. The housekeeper, who was a surgeon in her home country, the transport aide who has a nursing degree but couldn't afford to maintain his license, the cafeteria worker who understands pharmacology better than some residents. He paused, scanning the faces before him. We talk about diversity and inclusion in medicine, but we often limit that conversation to traditional pathways. True inclusion means recognizing expertise wherever it exists and creating opportunities for that knowledge to improve patient care. The young man whose life was saved 2 nights ago didn't care that his correct diagnosis came from someone in work clothes rather than scrubs. He needed someone to see beyond the obvious, to trust clinical instincts over protocol, to speak up when others remained silent. Marcus gestured toward the trauma department visible through the auditorium windows. Medicine isn't just about credentials and hierarchy. It's about knowledge applied with compassion, about being willing to listen to voices that might come from unexpected sources, about recognizing that healing can happen when we look beyond our assumptions. The entire auditorium stood as Marcus concluded his presentation, the thunderous applause reflecting not just appreciation for his words, but acknowledgement of a perspective that challenged fundamental assumptions about medical authority and expertise. In the weeks that followed, the Hidden Expertise Recognition Program identified 12 hospital employees with advanced medical training who had been working in positions that didn't utilize their full capabilities. Maria Santos, a housekeeper with a medical degree from El Salvador, was fast-tracked through the residency application process. David Kim, a transport aide with nursing credentials, was offered a position in the ICU. Elena Petrov, a cafeteria supervisor who had been a pharmacist in Russia, joined the Medication Safety Committee. Marcus's own transition back to active medicine proceeded smoothly, his clinical skills proving as sharp as ever despite his time away from practice. Patients responded to his calm competence, colleagues appreciated his unique perspective on hospital culture, and residents learned from someone who understood both the practice of medicine and the experience of being overlooked. 3 months after that night in Trauma Bay 3, Marcus received a call from Jake Morrison, the young man whose case had changed everything. Jake had recovered fully from his pneumothorax and returned to college, but he wanted to thank the doctor who had seen what others missed. "I heard about what happened that night," Jake said during their phone conversation. "How you were working." "As an orderly, but had been a doctor." how you saved my life, even though nobody would listen to you. I wanted you to know that I'm studying medicine now because of you. Because of me? Marcus asked, surprised by the revelation. Because you showed me that being a doctor isn't about titles or status. It's about caring enough to speak up when someone's life is at stake, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. That's the kind of physician I want to become. As Marcus hung up the phone in his new office, a space with his name on the door and windows overlooking the trauma department where his medical career had been reborn, he reflected on the journey from invisible orderly to respected physician. The path had been unexpected and painful, marked by sacrifices and setbacks that had tested his resilience and self-worth, but it had also taught him something invaluable about the nature of healing and the many forms that medical expertise could take. Sometimes the most important diagnoses came from those who had been overlooked, and sometimes the greatest service to medicine meant challenging the very structures that defined medical authority. The white coat he wore now felt different than the ones from his Boston days, not just because of the California hospital logo, but because it carried the weight of hard-won wisdom about humility, perseverance, and the courage to speak truth regardless of personal cost. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson walked through the corridors of St. Catherine's Medical Center with the confident stride of someone who belonged. The trauma department hummed with its usual controlled chaos, but now his presence was not only welcomed, but sought after. Young residents approached him with complex cases, nurses consulted him on unusual presentations, and patients requested the doctor who truly listened to their concerns. The Hidden Expertise Recognition Program had become a model for hospitals nationwide, identifying and utilizing medical knowledge that had been hiding in plain sight. Marcus had been invited to present their findings at national conferences, his research on institutional bias and overlooked talent earning recognition from medical organizations across the country. But perhaps the most satisfying change was the simplest one, the way people saw each other in the hospital's daily operations. Housekeepers were asked about their observations of patient behavior, transport aides contributed insights about mobility issues, and cafeteria staff shared nutritional concerns that affected patient recovery. The rigid hierarchies that had once defined medical authority had given way to a more collaborative approach to patient care. Marcus maintained an office in the emergency department, but he made it a point to spend time in other areas of the hospital, talking with environmental services, learning from maintenance staff, and ensuring that the voices of all hospital employees were heard and valued. His experience of being invisible had taught him to see others who might be overlooked. Jake Morrison visited occasionally during school breaks, his pre-med studies progressing well as he worked toward becoming the kind of physician Marcus had shown him was possible. During one visit, he brought his girlfriend, the young woman who had waited anxiously in the trauma bay that night, praying for someone to help the person she loved. "He talks about you all the time," she told Marcus during their conversation in his office, "about how you didn't give up on him even when everyone else had made their diagnosis. That's why he wants to become a doctor, to be someone who keeps looking when others stop seeing." Marcus smiled at her words, remembering his own journey from invisible orderly to respected physician. The transformation hadn't just been professional, it had been personal, teaching him that worth wasn't determined by job titles or external recognition, but by the willingness to use whatever knowledge and skills he possessed in service of others. The lesson extended far beyond medicine. In every workplace, in every community, there were people whose talents remained hidden because they didn't fit expected patterns or come from traditional sources. True progress happened when institutions became willing to look beyond appearances and assumptions to recognize excellence wherever it existed. As his shift ended, Marcus made his usual rounds through the hospital, greeting the staff members, who had once been his colleagues in the invisible ranks of hospital workers. He understood now that his 18 months as an orderly hadn't been a detour from his medical career. They had been an essential part of becoming the physician he was meant to be. The young man who had nearly died from a missed diagnosis had recovered completely, but the ripple effects of that night continued to spread through St. Catherine's Medical Center and beyond. Medical schools now included training on recognizing bias and listening to diverse voices. Hospital systems implemented programs to identify hidden expertise among their staff, and patients benefited from a more inclusive approach to medical care. Sometimes the most important voices in any organization are the quietest ones, and sometimes the greatest expertise comes from those who have learned to see clearly from positions of humility. The true measure of any institution isn't found in its hierarchy or prestige, but in its willingness to recognize truth and talent wherever they appear. In medicine, as in life, healing often begins with the simple act of truly seeing the people around us.